Hello everyone and welcome to the second episode of SwiftUI APIs and modifiers. So today we are going to learn about the different sizes of grids, and we will also look at what's the difference between LazyVGrid and LazyHGrid. So as I mentioned, the VGrid will VStack expands vertically. Similarly, VGrid expands vertically. So if our grid is expanding vertically, what we need to specify is we need to just specify the number of columns. And for edge grid, which is expanding horizontally, so it will expand horizontally as much item as it has in that grid. We just need to specify the number of rows. Why number of rows, why not column? Because it is expanding horizontally. So for lazy edge grid, we specify number of rows, and for lazy v grid, we specify number of columns. So let's start. We will be looking at three sizes of grid, which is flexible, fixed and adaptive. So we can see here is an example of flexible grid on the screen, and we have fixed grid which is placed in horizontal grid, and adaptive grid which is placed in v grid, vertical grid. So let's start with an empty file. Here we have an empty Swift file, and now I'm going to import SwiftUI, and after importing SwiftUI I'm going to create a structure with a VStack in it. Next, I'm going to create a flexible grid view, and I'm going to specify the number of columns. Right now I'm specifying columns because I will be using LazyVGrid for flexible grid. So let's create a grid items flexible. So this specifies that I have added one column for our grid. If I need two columns, I will add one more column to it. So now it has two columns. After adding columns, now the number of rows will be determined by the number of items in our LazyVGrid. So let's create a LazyVGrid. Now after creating LazyVGrid, it asks about the number of columns, and then again I'm repeating, the number of items will tell us number of rows that we will have in our LazyVGrid. So if we look at our example, we have total 4 items. So we are going to create a for each loop for 4 items, which will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 0 to less than 4. And now I'm going to create a rounded rectangle in it. And after creating rounded rectangle, let's add a preview to look at how it's presented. So here we have a lazy VGrid, and in that VGrid we have added 4 items. Now I'm going to make it clean by adding padding in it. So what it will do is that it will create space from left, right and top, bottom. Okay, so this is flexible grid. Now, so as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 types: flexible, adaptive and fixed. So right now we have created a flexible grid, and the flexible fills this space equally. Like the number of items are going to fill the space equally. If I have 4 items, they are going to fill the space equally in our V grid. So now we are going to look at the example of fixed grid. Right, I am adding rows because if you look at our example, we have horizontal scroll, which means we have lazy edge grid. And as I mentioned, edge grid expands horizontally, so there is no need to specify the number of columns. We just need to specify the number of rows. So I have specified 2 rows here, and now I'm going to create a lazy edge grid in a VStack with a scroll view. So now when I'm going to create a lazy edge grid, it will ask about rows, not column. So here it says to add the number of rows. So we will add the number of rows that we have mentioned here in our fixed grid. So here we have specified that the number of rows will be 2. And after adding lazy edge grid with rows 2, we are going to add the rounded rectangles. If we look at our example, we have around 20 rounded rectangles. So we will add the 20 rounded rectangle. We are going to add the condition of 0 to 20. Now one more thing which is important is that whenever we are adding items in our lazy V grid, we are going to specify its height because it is expanding vertically. But whenever we are going to create a lazy edge grid which will expand horizontally, we are going to specify its width. So we are going to add width in it because the height is already mentioned here in our rows. So for the fixed grid, we add the fixed height or fixed width. Now we just have dot fix here. It is not asking about the fixed height or fixed width. But if we are using lazy V grid, so this denotes our width. But if we are using lazy edge grid, this will denote our height. So we have already specified height here. Now we are going to specify width over here. So I have just made the correction of width here, and it's populated perfectly. So now I'm going to add a padding in it to make it look more clean. So here we have an example of fixed grid and flexible grid. Now we are going to create our third grid, which is adaptive grid. So let's create an adaptive grid. So now before starting adaptive grid, let me explain what adaptive grid is. So for the adaptive grid, we specify the minimum points or size of our item, and it look how much space it has in the grid. If our item size is 100 and our screen size is 300, so it is going to fill 3 items. So let's look at how to create an adaptive grid. So we are going to create an adaptive. So now I have created an adaptive grid. I have already added vgrid and explained above. What we need to understand in adaptive is that we specify the minimum point or minimum size. So let me first call adaptive grid in our grid layout view so that we can preview it. So here we have an adaptive grid. This is our adaptive grid. So why it is filling 3 items? Like the screen size is somewhere around 300 something. We have given an item size of minimum to 100. So it is going to fill 100, 100 and 100. It is going to fill, it will fill as much item as it can. Now let's increase the minimum size. If I'm going to make it to 200. So after making it to 200, we can see that it has filled the item. This doesn't mean that I'm also specifying the maximum. Minimum means that minimum is 200. If the screen size is 300, you just need to fill that item in that container. So if I have a size of container 300 and I'm specifying minimum 200, which means it cannot populate 2 items of 200 width. So it's going to populate just one item. It's going to fill with it, and it's adaptive, so it's going to adapt its grid size. Now let's see if I'm going to create 150. Now after adding 150, it's going to populate 2 items. Yes. So first, whenever I am going to change the minimum width or height of our grid item, it is going to look in the container whether it has a capacity to store it or not. If it has the capacity, so it is going to look at the number of items it can fill in that container. So this was it, where we learned about LazyVGrid, LazyHGrid, and we look at the 3 sizes of grid layout: adaptive, flexible and fixed. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more APIs and modifiers.